Hi, I'm Angelo Lewis, the Sacred Inclusion Network, and today I'm interviewing Raphael Cushnir. And just a little bit about the network. We're a group of people that consider ourselves spiritual but not religious, which is a demographic term. And our mission is to change, not to change, but to nurture the aspirations of change makers, people that want to change the world, that are spiritually oriented. And today, it's my enormous honor to interview Raphael Cushnir, who's the author of 6 or 7 books. And before I get into it, let me tell you a little bit about Raphael. He's a leading voice in the world of emotional connection and present moment awareness. You may have read his words in either his 6 books or his articles in magazine, the Oprah magazine, Spirituality and Health, Psychology Today, and Huffington Post. As I said, he's the author of 6 books. He lectures worldwide. He's a faculty member of the Esalen Institute, the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, and the Omega Institute for Holistic Studies. He also coaches individuals, he coached me, and teams at Fortune 100 companies, governments, and religious organizations, and leading nonprofits. And we're going to talk a little bit about his most recent book. But in any event, Raphael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you again.
Thank you. Why don't you start off a little bit? This is a kind of a pro forma question, but tell me a little bit about, and not too long, but about your early spiritual and religious sort of upbringing.
Yeah, well, happy to do that. I was a practical mystic from a very early age. When I was in high school, I had a psychology teacher who introduced me during summer school to Fritz Perls and Gestalt therapy, to Alan Watts, Carl Rogers, and I just gobbled all that stuff up. I grew up traditionally Jewish, but I was always drawn to the Hasidic and the more mystical parts of that tradition. But I also, when I said the word practical, it has to do with the fact that I didn't ever really want to believe anything that I hadn't experienced directly. And I grew up in Southern California in the 70s, and there was lots and lots of new age kind of stuff. And I was both attracted to it and a little bit repelled by it. So I would wrestle with that whole issue and waited to start experiencing things directly, especially so that I couldn't wonder, am I creating this myself because I want to? And that's kind of a little bit of a lead into what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, and I'm right with you with the experience thing. A lot of people talk about a lot of things that they've read about or heard from others, but they don't have the direct experience. And unless you do, you don't really know what you're talking about. It's really as simple as that.
Absolutely.
So I know that you're an avid spiritual practitioner, and you've been engaged in what some people call spiritual practice probably for most of your life. Tell me a little bit about some of the forms it's taken.
Well, I think I started out being a kind of a straight up mindfulness or Vipassana meditator. But I also really heeded the words of Jack Kornfield, who said that, when he came back from Burma to teach in the West, that he came to realize that Buddhism without psychotherapy is incomplete, and psychotherapy without some kind of spiritual framework is also incomplete. So I became a meditator while I was being therapized, and kind of continue to let those two things sort of nurture each other. And then later on, especially around the time of the events in the book that we're going to talk about today, I started doing a practice which is a meditation in action. It's less like setting aside time, and it's more about how to be radically present in any given moment. And it's called, there's a practice, it's kind of esoteric, but you can find it. It's called turning the light around, which has to do with noticing that our perception goes outward to whatever it is that we're perceiving, but we can turn that arrow back and look at the perceiver. Where is that perception coming from in us? And that was introduced to me in a book called The Secret of the Golden Flower by Thomas Cleary.
Classic book, yeah.
Yeah, so that's something. So in other words, in these days, when I just recognize that I'm not radically present in the way that I choose to be, I turn the light around towards the experience that I'm having and the experiencer who's having that experience, and it makes everything pop into fullness and brightness and clarity.
Oh, that's beautiful. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say we're going to talk about your book and some of the discoveries that you made there. But you're kind of, I mean, I'll call you an expert on, I would call it emotional intelligence, but you have this, what are you calling it now? You're calling it emotional presence or something.
Emotional connection, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe a little off the wall question, but can you connect that to spirituality in some way? Not that it needs to be connected, but
oh gosh, I mean, that's the most pleasurable thing for me to do, because I feel like emotions are the nexus between self and spirit. We don't choose consciously how we feel moment to moment, but when we also do choose, which we can, to tune in to our emotional experience in our bodies and to surf, that's the word I like to use, to surf those emotions inside of us, it brings us to a state of greater presence and expansion, which then allows us to connect with and co-create with spiritual or divine energy. So I mean, it's possible to have a spiritual orientation without being emotionally intelligent or connected, but very difficult to do. And you can't do it in a way that is embodied. And so since emotions live in the body, and that's where we surf them, the process of surfing our emotions gives us an opportunity to have an embodied spiritual approach. And that's what's most meaningful to me.
yeah, I would imagine it's kind of hard to do it otherwise,
Right. You could be a practitioner of like Raja Yoga,
Yeah.
using your brain and your third eye. And I don't want to disparage that, but I think that when we pretend to be beings without bodies, it creates all other kinds of shadow issues for us.
I love what you said in the beginning when you talked about your meditation practice, and you referenced Jack Kornfield. In the West, this emotional intelligence or learning about our psychology, it's very important. Maybe if we were in Asia or something like that, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But we're so analytical. We need to understand our minds and our emotions. It seems like a good wedding. In order to keep our spirituality grounded in a certain way.
Yeah, and I think right now, as we're speaking, there are certain waves in the world of personal growth that have had come to preeminence. There's trauma-informed therapy and understanding. There's also attachment therapy and the understanding around that. And both of those things all take place in the body. You can't really heal trauma without learning to have a new relationship with your body. You can't really unwind and heal some of your damaging attachment patterns if you don't know how they play out in the physical space of your body. So I feel like the more we learn, both from the East and the West, the more critical it is to focus whatever we're doing in an embodied way.
So we're going to talk about kriyas and your most recent book, and tell me the name of it, because
It's called Surviving the Divine, and the subtitle is A Memoir of Rude Awakening.
And this is sort of an aside, but in there it seemed like your publisher wanted you to change the title or something like that, and you didn't actually get to how you came to this title, but it doesn't matter. But it's a wonderful book.
Actually, that was a different book.
Oh, really? Okay.
This title was always the same, except for the subtitle, which came at the end. And I love to be able to say rude awakening because we use that term colloquially. But in my actual experience, it was rude. It was messy in ways that I had no way to understand, or I had to kind of just wrestle my way through. And so it's not just a turn of phrase. It's an accurate depiction of what I was going through.
And I salute you for being so candid in terms of all the things that you went through. Many people, they have this sort of, you use the expression, which is like an old macrobiotic expression, the bigger the front, the bigger the back. Whatever has the front has a back. I grew up in that sort of world. So when I read that, I knew I was going to finish the whole book. Mm-hmm. In any event, you really go into it. You talk about your own experience, the dark side of it, and coming a little bit closer to the light, shall we say. But in any event, in your book, you talk about your experience with kriyas, which I describe as involuntary movements that can occur in a meditative or even outside of a meditative concept. Before you get to those, I'm wondering if you've experienced other direct physical effects of your spiritual practice other than being calm, let's say.
Well, I would expand the definition of kriyas to include also spontaneous sounds that emanate from oneself. Um, and so in my case, those were present also. They still tend to be present. Even spontaneous chanting or sounding that has words in it that may actually exist in some language or may just be gibberish. It's sometimes hard to tell. Um, and then also the signature experience of the Kundalini awakening that I had, that's the best term for it, although there are others, is an energy arising within the physical body that always is moving and wanting to go up through the energy centers or chakras, and then often gets sidetracked or waylaid. And so there's a whole host of inner experiences that go along with that. The kriyas are more the externally available ones. You can see them, other people can see them. But sometimes it was the experience of an inner fire where I would just become hollowed out with heat. Sometimes there would be incredible chills. Sometimes the energy would rise up. I could literally watch it while I wasn't doing anything to make it happen. As it would move through my being, it would go up to the top of my head. Sometimes it would keep going upward. Sometimes it would come down the front towards what's called the hara in the belly area. So a lot of inner experiences, which are subjective, not discernible on the outside, but really palpable on the inside.
So I'm sure this didn't happen overnight. So was there a particular time when this all of a sudden it happened, and what happened? Just give me a sense of.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where there's like the long tail that led to it, and then there's the moment in which it was instantaneous, and both of those things are true, and I talk a lot about that in the book. But the main thing that brought it about was not purposeful on my part. I had gone through a really dramatic and painful separation from my marriage at the time, and I didn't know that I was doing this. I didn't have these words for it. But because I decided I didn't want to run away from the pain, I wanted to stay with it as much as possible, I ended up doing a kind of one-pointed meditation on suffering. And as I say, that sounds highfalutin. That's not how I saw it at the time. At the time, I just tried to keep coming back to what I was experiencing. And I did that for about 6 months. And then I had a kind of moment of explosive grace, you could say, where I was just minding my own business, doing a meditation on my meditation bench. And suddenly I noticed in my mindfulness that my body was starting to sway back and forth. And that had never happened before. And I was thinking, I'm not choosing to do that. Why is that happening? And then from there, very quickly, small and subtle movements became, uproarious and overwhelming movements that either I could try to stop or could let go, let happen. And something intuitively told me that it was important to let it happen and just be curious and see what it was. But from the very beginning, it was both exalted and also a pain in the ass, because the first couple of times that I did let it happen, I would have the experience of being thrust into position so harshly by this energy that I would actually pull muscles in my body and have to stop. So from the very beginning, I realized that there was this force that maybe it had divine intelligence, maybe it was spiritual in nature, but also it didn't really understand what a body was. And it wasn't interested in protecting me. And it wasn't going to give me like special dispensation, Raphael, congratulations, you've passed the test. It wasn't anything like that. It had its own propulsive quality that I had to figure out how to live with, as opposed to only surrender to, because, you can't just pull your back every day and still live a life in the world like I was still needing to do.
Yeah, and you describe it kind of calmly, but as you describe in the book, in some cases it was kind of inconvenient, let's say. I mean, you might even be in a public setting, and all of a sudden you have this sort of eruption of energy, which makes your body move in sort of weird ways, let's call it.
Yes, and I, in trying to learn more about what was happening to me, I would find different people's stories about that and their own ways of dealing with it. And people who would be surprising, like the meditation teacher, Sylvia Borstein, who's like a nice Jewish
famous, yeah.
type. Yeah. She would talk about, being in the grocery store and all of a sudden her hand would start flapping and she'd have to decide, to let it go, or is she embarrassed, and what's the checker going to think? So there were times where I couldn't really contain it. So I'd have to disguise it So in ways that people wouldn't be freaked out. So if it looked like I was doing yoga postures, then people would leave me alone, right? Then there were other times when it did sort of allow me to obey social mores, like if I'm in a business meeting or something like that. After the first month or two when it was just incredibly out of control, after that, it would sort of let that happen. Like, I feared over many years, and we're talking about something that started 25 years ago. There are many times when I feared that somehow it was going to get me in real trouble, like it was going to get me committed, which sometimes it does for people, especially if their own systems can't work with it in some way, synthesize it. But lucky for me in that case, I never was like arrested or anything like that.
Well, that's good. I share with you in an email, one of the things, I'm not totally unfamiliar with what you're talking about, but it was interesting to me to think about my early upbringing, where I learned to bring about these kind of spontaneous movements consciously, which is, so it was, I don't read about experiences like yours very often, unless you go to the esoteric literature and you could find them. You mentioned you mentioned your experience to other people that were maybe more experienced. How common would you say this kind of phenomena is in your experience?
Well, it depends exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, for example, it's become more and more clear that for people who meditate, and of course, meditation has grown by leaps and bounds in the West, and especially here in the US over the last 20 or 30 years, that there's a subset of people who have difficult and unwanted experiences that arise through the course of meditation. There's even at Brown University, a scholar named Willoughby Brown, who's collected thousands of first-person accounts of people who are having these difficult experiences. So I think that that's growing in and of itself. But all difficult experiences that arise from meditation aren't the same, and definitely aren't what I'm calling a Kundalini awakening. I think Kundalini awakenings also are happening more and more, and I can't say exactly why, except maybe there's more people who are entering into that realm, so to speak. But there's also a distinction between people who are choosing to cultivate certain states versus things that are happening that are outside of their control or choosing. So for example, many of your listeners might know that there's something called Kundalini Yoga, and it's a big community, it's international. And when I first started having all of my kriyas and other issues, one of the first things I did was intuitively check them out and made a phone call and said, help, what am I supposed to do? And surprisingly, what happened in my case is that the person I talked to said, oh, well, we do these practices in order to prepare the body for the possible likelihood, if we're fortunate, that we will awaken our Kundalini in a large way. And so as far as you, who's had that happen in a body that apparently isn't very prepared for it and is having a lot of trouble with it, we got nothing.
Nothing for you.
Yeah. And but one thing for me, kind of dovetailing with what I said before about how I didn't believe anything that I didn't experience directly. Also, once this started, I really decided that I didn't want to try to use it or control it or direct it in any way. As much as possible, and sometimes it wasn't possible, but as much as possible, I wanted to let it unfold. And I did find, I was very lucky to find before he died, a wonderful yoga scholar named Georg Feuerstein, who basically said to me, because I was going around like, that children's book, Are You My Mother? Are You My Mother? I was going around when I had all this crazy stuff going to every teacher I could find. Are you my teacher? Are you my expert? Do you know what to do? When I went to him, he said in his experience, virtually everything that we do to try to change it or make it easier when we're going through it actually makes it last longer and become more difficult. And as much as possible, he suggested, just let it play itself out. And that's pretty much been my edict over the years. Not always, but most of the time, if I notice that I'm starting to try to make something happen, then I just back off and surrender. And that's been, for the most part, the most peaceful approach.
I think you alluded to this. I think we should sort of at least expand this, because we're talking about a specific particular form of movement in general. But there's other things that happen during spiritual practice that can happen to people. One you alluded to is like in 7 Day Adventists, all the time they start speaking in tongues, for example. Other things are just seeing bright lights or hearing different kinds of things. All these kind of things can result from spiritual practice and maybe without spiritual practice to human beings. And I think that we're developing a vocabulary for these things because they were seen as something odd or something mystical or something that doesn't happen. I guess my belief is that depending on how we're grading, what kind of gradations we're using, these kind of experiences are relatively common. Maybe not with the intensity of a Raphael Cushnir experience, but there are little subtle things which I think hope we can explore when during your event for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So just when you talked about lights, I think that's an important one. I want to bring that up. There's something I describe in the book where one day the energy literally pulled me out of my meditation chair and took me to the mirror in my bathroom. And I started gazing directly into my own eyes. And as I did that, my field of vision was starting to just turn to black. Like I was looking just like I'm looking at you right now, but suddenly I couldn't see. And against that black background came this incredibly powerful blue light, just gorgeous kind of glowing cobalt blue light. And as it would get brighter, the energy inside of me started to get more intense. So sort of like, and it felt like I was going to explode into a million pieces. And then I would just let it go, hoping it didn't explode me. And then at a certain point, the light was super bright. The sound, the inner vibration was super intense. And then just like that, it would stop. And then it would go back down to the beginning, low tone, low inner, vibration, less bright light. And it would increase that process over and over again until it got to whatever was the cutoff switch when my being couldn't handle any more than that. And then it would stop and start again. And why I'm going to some lengths to describe the story, because you were talking about like, let's look at some of these things, is that I had no idea that there was an ancient spiritual practice of mirror gazing, that people had been taught over the years to actually do this in order to cultivate and raise up spiritual energy. So whatever the innate intelligence of this that woke up in me, which is not me, not part of my personality anyway, that I had learned to live with for 35 years before this. If it's me in quotations, it's a much broader transpersonal me that I don't have access to in a direct way. But it knew something about that mirror gazing that I didn't know. And then even more to the point, way back when I was that teenager we were talking about, I went to Israel and somebody took me to a kind of secret spiritual ceremony that I write about in the book, where it's pitch black in the room, and especially black because there are all the black coats and hats of the Orthodox Jews that are in there, all men, unfortunately. And they were doing the same thing, not with light, but with sound. They'd start with a very low drone and it would get higher and higher and higher and higher until it would be deafening. And then at some unknown signal that I couldn't figure out, it would just go to silence and then start again. So I like to say that all religions are definitely not the same, but the mystical core at the heart of almost all the world's religions is the same. That's where it doesn't have words, it doesn't have beliefs that get us in trouble and that kill each other and judge each other. But at the mystical core, which is all about spiritual experience, they're all tapping into the same well. So whether I was in Israel as a teenager or whether I was at home going into the bathroom, I feel like, there's a wisdom that's being opened and made available. And that's what connects those experiences.
Yeah, and a lot of practices are about sort of eliciting some of the things you experience. Like, for example, sound is pretty universally used, like drumming, for example, to help build up something, build some sort of consciousness of something which is beyond you, that in a sense can connect you to a communal experience or connect you to an experience which is, to use your word, a transpersonal experience.
Yes, absolutely. And so on the one hand, in my workshops, I often use things like sound, things like visualization to help raise the energy for people. But on the other hand, I'm also really careful because I think there's a real difference between choosing to open to whatever is available versus telling people that there's a direct path to a particular experience, like in this case, my own. In other words, there's a healing energy that comes through with this, but I wouldn't set my shingle up as a healer and tell people I'm going to teach them how to heal other people, because mostly it happens by me getting out of the way, by me letting it do its own thing, which is something that, at least for me, can't really be taught. I know there are some people who are able to create like a lexicon or a pathway to teach some of these things. But for me, because it was always spontaneous, I'm really careful about telling people that I know anything about their own experience or how to do this for themselves. But on the other hand, going back to what you were saying, because I think this is really important, there's a spontaneous kind of shamanic component to it as well. So for example, if you and I were going to go into kind of a sacred session here, and I just got quiet and let myself drop into a fuller presence, that's like a light switch turned on for the energy. The energy will take that space. And so suddenly I might be having this happen, or I might be having whistles coming through me. I might be shaking in the way that we were talking about kriyas, and not because it's special or great or exalted. It's just, that's what the energy, that's like the instrument of my body registers the energy that way. And sometimes through being in shared presence, it does uplift, it does create movement and flow, as long as we don't like get too worried about what it is and what it isn't, or get it too much into our heads. So I never know from moment to moment what it's going to do. But as long as I get out of the way and let it do it, and as long as another person or a group of people are willing to be impacted by it, it seems to have an uplifting quality.
There's a phrase you keep using, which I think is so important for all of us to understand. And that's getting out of your own way. You know, I don't know exactly what that's about. Maybe it's about the ego, but there's a larger force that we're all part of. This one sort of focus of ego is a sort of a limited focus. And a lot of times with just simple problems in life, if we can sort of get out of our own way, the problems can solve itself. And that's kind of like a crude analogy for what you're talking about.
No, I think it's very important what you're sharing. And, you know, everything that's meaningful to me in the spiritual realm usually, or it does, come in the form of paradox. And so there's a paradox around the experience of oneness, because the more that we open to our lives spiritually, the more we see that there's no separation between us and the world around us, no separation between us and other people, and no separation between us and spirit, however we want to call or name that. So that's one thing. On the other hand, once you recognize that, you still are a functioning human being living on planet Earth, and you still need to have, you know, your own separate individual experiences. You need to take care of that part of life as well. So I sometimes refer to that as seeing the fabric and being the thread. And the paradox is, how do you do those two things at the same time? There's no simple answer. There's just a dropping in more and more to that possibility. But where that connects to what you were just talking about is that the more we hold and experience that sense of oneness while we're still an individual, we have the palpable experience of co-creating with spirit. Things happen, synchronicities arise, solutions come about, which we couldn't have figured out or gotten to by our own if we're just stuck in the more individual side of things. We don't have the broader oneness part of things. So it's for small things in life and for big things in life, you know, if I want myself to follow them through with the greatest degree of peace and grace and compassion and love, I've got to keep surrendering to the whole while also taking care of, you know, what I need to do personally. So it works in almost every situation, what you're describing.
I hear of individuals and I read them, like, I guess I have a glimpse of it. I certainly don't experience it many times, but there are people that claim that they're just part of everything. They don't see themselves as a separate ego. And for some people, that seems to be what the liberation thing is. When all of a sudden their duality is just shattered, and all of a sudden they're just like doing this thing. I'm certainly not there, but that just sounds like a goal. I'd love to be there.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't want to be there, because I've been given the chance to live an earthly life on this planet and to follow my own karma, so to speak, to learn and grow as an individual, and to kind of make love to my life moment by moment, whether it's a beautiful movie I'm watching, or whether it's a protest that I'm taking part in. Like I want to be me and and like drink all the juice that's available in that kind of life, while also knowing that I'm not separate. If I just only was all one, it would be kind of boring in a way. And I know some people might choose that, and that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But for me personally, I'd much rather blend the two while I'm here, because once I'm dead, I think I'll have lots of time, if there's even time in that realm, to be one with everything.
Yeah, I don't. From what I've read, I think it's not something you choose. It just sort of happens in any event, you know.
But you still have to pay your taxes, you know.
You definitely do. You have to like what's the word? You have to carry water. What is the old expression?
Chop wood, carry water.
Thank you very much. I couldn't remember it. You mentioned protests, and that's like a very appropriate segue that I want to share with you. As you know, this is like a very sort of confusing time. All sorts of things happening. As we're speaking, there's all these different trials that are racially oriented, people in the streets, there's climate change, you know. So and sometimes I talk to spiritual people, and sometimes I talk to myself this way, and I'm thinking, I don't want to deal with any of this kind of stuff. You know, I just want to like follow my bliss or whatever. I know from reading your book, and I know a little bit about you personally, you were a very committed activist at one point. So how do you personally balance, if you do, I'll call it spiritual awareness and social responsibility?
Yeah, this is a beautiful, difficult topic for sure that I'm very passionate about. I have a lot of don't knows, and you know, I'm still curious. But I think probably the one shadow side more than anything else in Western, especially American non-religious spirituality, is that people burn out in their lives, or their traumas come to the surface, and one way or another, they get turned on to healing. And almost always for a period of time, they say, I can't really focus on the world anymore. I've got to focus on myself. And maybe my inner healing is the best contribution that I have to a world in chaos and despair. And I understand that. I was that way too. But I would say, excuse me, that's only the first part of the journey. That if we don't come back in a more healed and whole way and take up the mantle of whatever activism is important to us, then what we do is we seed the playing field, so to speak, to people who are living in darkness and who are spreading darkness all around us. And that can't make sense. That can't be right as far as I'm concerned. So I'm with the people who sometimes refer to themselves as pleasure activists, or who want to try to figure out how to have righteous, expansive anger when they need to have a boundary or a no, as opposed to contracted and negative or judgmental anger. People who are trying to figure out how to be the change, as that cliche says, but to stand for the change, and also to stand against certain changes, which are, you know, against life, and, you know, against people, and against spirit, and against the planet. So there's no one easy way to do it. Everyone has a challenge, you know, in their own lives. But I've been interested over the years in people who are trying to figure all of that out. And just to give you a quick example, one time I learned of this group called the Ruckus Society, which was a wonderful name. And they held things that they called Action Camp. And Action Camp was where they taught people, especially young people, how to do direct action, you know, how to stop a ship in the ocean, how to climb a 30-story building and unfurl a banner. But most of the people there were doing that out of love and out of solidarity. And when I was there trying to learn about stories, I wanted to write about some of these people. And kind of shyly, a few women came up to me and said, you know, we hear that you're looking for stories about how we do this. And, you know, we want to tell you, but we don't want to do it here. So like, could we meet down, you know, at the pub a mile away? And so I didn't know what this was all about, but I happily went to get the story. And they told me, these young women, that they really were dedicated to their activism, but they had no way to make a living doing it. So they started basically becoming what they called strippers for the environment. So And this was Portland, Oregon, so it's a little bit not like the rest of the country.
Right.
But there was literally a particular strip club where they were going and not only stripping in a traditional way, but also becoming friends with the patrons there. And they would hold fundraisers for their activism. And the same guys who would come see them in the strip club would actually come and contribute to their causes.
Wow.
It was all done with sex positive, loving, committed activism. And I was just so humbled because these people were just trying to figure it out, right? And I think what figuring it out means is, how do I stand for what I do stand for without just joining the screaming throngs who are hurling judgments and epithets at each other more today than ever in my whole lifetime, for sure. So it's an ongoing challenge, but I feel like if we don't come back into the world and figure that out for ourselves, then in a way, the spiritual practice has failed. It's made us become separate in our own cocoon from everything and everyone around us, which is the opposite of the oneness that you and I were talking about.
Yeah, that's so wonderfully put. And I like that you preface it by saying that you're full of questions about this, because I am too, to be honest with you. I know I don't want to join the screaming hordes. But what do I do with this anger? How do I learn how to deal with it appropriately? It's an emotion. It's part of life, and it can be put to use like anything else, and it isn't about necessarily throwing rocks at things.
Yeah, and I remember, when the first or the second? I guess the second Iraq War was about to break out, and there was a protest in San Francisco, and I was living there, and I was there with my girlfriend at the time, and we were marching, and we had our signs or whatever, and then we noticed that on the path of the protest there was someone who had set up a drum kit and was drumming. And you mentioned drumming before as a practice, and so we were really called to it, and we just stopped, and instead of walking, we just danced the rest of the time with the drums and tried to generate love that we could. There's a phrase in Tibetan Buddhism called dedicating the merit, which is when you experience exalted or heightened states, you send that positive energy out to other people who may need it. And for some people that may seem like esoteric or woo-woo, or how's that going to change what's going on at my local school board? But for me, it was really important. It was a way of generating positive energy in a sphere where there was a lot of negative energy. And it didn't preclude me from protesting in other ways. It just let my heart be involved. And I think if we're not leading from our heart when it comes to social change, then we're going to contribute to the problems rather than really solve them.
I'm thinking about a story from my youth. I went to some demonstration in Washington or something, and I needed a ride. So I hitchhiked with this guy who was a pacifist. And as we're driving into DC, this guy let out the most cursing everybody. And he was a pacifist, It was such a paradox to me. I'll never forget it as long as I live. Why you, I'm a pacifist. Okay, you're a pacifist. One of the things I want to investigate that you created this series, which I really want to download, Teaching Which We Need to Learn, in which you interviewed 45 leaders of personal growth and spirituality about their own growing edges. And there's I think you have the URL, Teaching What We Need to Learn. Is people want to access it. I plan on accessing it. So it's about asking people such as yourself or some other, I'll call them human potential leaders, about their own growing edges. So the question is, what do you think are your growing edges? That's the first part. And the second part is, what did you learn about yourself from doing that series?
Yeah, these are really great questions. So first of all, what are my growing edges? I think that probably the biggest one is that I can tend towards, even though it's squirmy to admit this, I can tend towards arrogance. I think I know what's going on. And I would rather live from a place of inquiry. Socrates said something along the lines of, the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. So in theory, that's where I'd like to come from. But I fall short often because I think I've been around long enough and I've seen it all and I know it all. And so that know-it-all quality is something which I think is annoying to me and sometimes to other people, and especially to my kids. So that's one growing edge. As far as what I took away from doing this series. So, we talked before, you mentioned that adage, the bigger the front, the bigger the back. And I notice that when I invite spiritual teachers and other kinds of leaders to talk about their growing edges, some of them do it very quickly and beautifully. And others, I can just pull and pull and pull and try to demonstrate and model, and they're not going there with me. And so I feel like when somebody isn't willing to show at least some degree of fallibility, and vulnerability in their
Humanity.
yeah, then I'm not interested in what they have to say. And they're selling or fronting, as I sometimes will call it, in terms of the bigger the front, the bigger the back. And so it was true in that series. And it's also true as I, move out into the world and I look at different people. Again, it's not so much a judgment like this person is good and this person is bad. It's more like, not for me. And where the not for me comes in is when I see someone who is not willing to share that humanity, because it feels like in a way, it's easier to hook people on that shiny life that you can sell them. But the way that you're doing it actually means that you're going to keep them from the true shiny life, because you're starting out with the idea that there's something that they don't have or that they need to get from you, so that they can be as happy and bright as you. And it's interesting in the previous generations, when there was spiritual teachers, oftentimes in spiritual communities and ashrams, things like that, there was a kind of a loyalty and a veneration that people were supposed to have with their teachers. Now, for better or for worse, maybe a combination of both, we live in a consumer-oriented marketplace where when you want to enter into the world of personal growth and healing, you can pick and choose whoever you want. Part of the challenge of that is that sometimes people who are going to tell you the hard truths or not sell you on how easy it is, that may not feel good. So you may be like, I'll drop that person. I'll go with the shinier one. Their workshop has 7 levels and it costs, $3,000, but they're promising me true enlightenment. I'll go with that one. So we've lost a little bit. I'm not saying that we need to overly respect anybody, but in the consumer-oriented marketplace around spirituality, people often tend to go towards the shiny, at the peril of the maybe deeper or harder work that they could do on themselves. And so I think I saw that mirrored in the interview series as well.
That's interesting. And I'm going to try to combine 2 questions here. I've met a lot of people who are spiritual teachers, some of whom are very famous. You've probably met more of them. You're in California, for God's sake. And this adage, the bigger the front, the bigger the back, is very interesting to me. Because some of these people, yes, they have a lot of power. They have just esteem. They can do this, that, and the other thing. But when you look at they're actually doing in their lives, there's sometimes can be this enormous duplicity going on. And to combine it with the other question, a lot of the times it involves controlling other people. A lot of times it involves manipulating other people. A lot of times it involves sexually manipulating other people. And you and I could sit here and come up with 10 different names of people that had sort of street cred, I'll call it. And when you really looked at what's going on, somehow it came out that so-and-so was sleeping with somebody. They're sleeping with 10 different people, and they're proclaiming celibacy for everybody else. All these kind of things, and so I have empathy for seekers that are trying to find somebody that will help them get there, and at the same time they don't want to be deceived. So I guess I'm making a little speech here, but I was trying to get into this, and this is like a larger. We don't have time to get into it, but one of the things your book talks about very directly is sexuality and spirituality. So very briefly, and this is a big topic, what have you learned about this with yourself?
Well, yeah, a huge topic, but one that's really close to my heart. I think that the important thing to recognize is that erotic energy is generative energy, meaning that it's creative in its very nature. And even in the language that we have for the beginning of this universe we live in, it's called the Big Bang, right? So everything is, I'm going to use a polite word, everything that exists is to some degree sexed into being. So when we can recognize that force is very primal and powerful, but also spiritual in its own way. And we can learn to open to that and cultivate that in ourselves from a heart-centered place. Then we have a power that is extraordinary, but also not abusable in the way that you were talking about. And this is true, not just even in terms of the world of, leaders with feet of clay, as you're referring to, but even just two people who are coming together in sexual union. I do a lot of work with people around sacred sexuality. And one of the most important things is the idea that if you arrive at your time together with your partner with the idea that something is supposed to happen, you're aiming towards any particular goal, then you've already lost so much of the delight and the transformation that might be available for you in that experience. So bringing presence to sexual energy and learning to get bigger and bigger in your capacity to hold and run with sexual energy, first of all, between you and yourself, and then also between you and another person, is almost like a gift of being, with a small g, a god. And I mean that in a lovely poetic sort of sense. Like, we're so much bigger than we think. We have so much more energy running through us. And it's a privilege to be able to tap into that energy. And I think that when we do, and sexuality is one way to do it, then we basically expand the human potential in ways that we couldn't have otherwise even imagined. So one way of thinking about transformation is if you imagine that your being is a radio dial, and when you first come into ego consciousness, you learn to tune in to a few channels on the dial. And then when you grow in your spirituality and your healing, you start to learn and recognize and be gifted with an awareness that there's many other dials now that you can tune into. And so life looks and feels much different, much more magical and mysterious than it did before. And some of those channels have to do with sexual energy and sexuality. And when we can bring those channels in as well, then there's a potency to who we are and how we express in the world that we wouldn't be able to experience otherwise. And that's why it's so important to me. But also, coming back to what I said before, it has to come through the heart. And so in my experience, there was a lot of testing around sexuality and sexual energy. That Kundalini energy would move through me, and it would create scenarios and experiences that seemed like foul sometimes, or confusing, or impure. And I was thrust into a kind of a controversy, like, should I still be listening to this inner voice? Should I still be following this energy? And I think that in large part, it was a purification process, if I can say that. I mean, I'm not sure, but it feels like I needed to go through all of that to get more heart-centered. And getting heart-centered in sexuality doesn't mean getting less powerful. It doesn't mean getting less raw. It just means that you can trust the energy as it's moving through you. And whether it's someone having a Kundalini experience like me, we're just going through their own life healing in their own way, the more those two things come together, heart energy and sexual energy, the more powerful and transformed, their lives can be.
Well said. Some people are listening to this may be curious about what you're going to do on December 9th. You probably haven't even thought about it, but I'll put you on the spot. We have this event that's called Navigating Spiritual Spates. What would you like people to get out of it off the top of your head?
Well, it's interesting because it's kind of coming full circle, because when I was talking in the beginning of our time today about the secret of the golden flower and that meditation called Turning the Light Around, I think the most important thing that I'm going to do is invite people to look more as a whole being and wholeheartedly at an experience that they're having in the moment. So for example, a lot of people haven't even been students of their own brain in such a way, like, you have a thought. Where is that thought? How do you find it? Do you have images that pop into your consciousness around that thought? What does it mean to sink more fully into the experience that you're having and see it more robustly? And here's the whole key. Years and years and years ago, speaking of paradox again, it seems strange to me that, like, I thought if I observe my experience, then I would become more removed from it, and I would be analyzing, and I would be alienated. But the more I learned how to look and how to come close to my experience, I found that the more fully I observed it, the more connected I became, and the richer the experience became. So the practices that we're going to play with have to do with helping people look more fully and then be able to see and be with what arises and have an experience that they wouldn't have otherwise.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And anybody wants to know more, I'll put it in the show notes. It's on December 9th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time in the United States. And, you know, everybody can do their own math. And I'm just going to tell, before I say goodbye to you formally, I want to tell people a little bit about the Sacred Inclusion Network, and then I'll say goodbye to you formally. The simplest way to, if you're interested in what we're doing, is go to our website, sacredinclusion.com. We have regular monthly events. Sometimes we do workshops. We have also a private community, which you can join, but I'll put a link up to it in the website. And you want to get more involved, you could see us on Facebook, or you can contribute to our Patreon page, all of which I'll tell you about. Raphael, I'm delighted to know you and to renew our friendship, our relationship. And I'm so delighted that you're going to do this event for us, and it's going to be a delight. Thank you so very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Can I say one more thing before we close?
Please, yeah.
So one of the reasons why I love talking to you today is because about 5 years or so ago, something like that, we were having conversations in which you were dreaming up what has since become the Sacred Inclusion Network. And you were wondering, you know, would I make it happen? Do I have the energy to make it happen? I don't know. Am I getting my own way? How do I get out of my own way? So to see that it's blossomed in the way that it has, and to be invited to be a part of it, is a real honor for me. So I wanted to salute you for that and let you know how fun it is to see it in its full flowering.
Well, thank you very much, my friend.